Hey guys, tonight we open the door into a world that is both dazzling and decayed, a place where royal splendor barely conceals the rotten secrets of flesh and power. You're lying in bed, your eyes growing heavy, and imagine a court where giant bouquets of roses fail to mask the stench that seeps from the king's own body. Sounds like a Shakespearean tragedy. The reality is far colder, far more grotesque. And if you think modern horror movies are unsettling, I'm sorry. You won't survive this story of the downfall of one of Europe's most powerful kings. The image is both majestic and haunting. A monarch once praised as the handsomest prince in Christendom, now reduced to a grotesque shadow of himself, bloated, in agony, forcing his courtiers to cover their noses just to endure his presence. And perhaps the darkest detail isn't the dying body itself, but the eerie silence in the palace, where everyone is forced to pretend nothing is wrong, because to even whisper about the king's death could mean execution for treason. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And one more thing. I'd truly love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your corner of the world right now? Share it in the comments, so we can see the audience gathering from every time zone to join this tale together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are lying still, listening to the steady hum of a fan, and imagining yourself drifting back to the end of the 15th century. No mobile phones, no Monday morning emails, only the sound of horse hooves echoing in the castle courtyard and the clear flute playing in courtly feasts. Amid that picture, the boy Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of June, 1491, in Greenwich, into the royal family. He was not the eldest son, so at first no one thought Henry would become king. Yet fate sometimes resembles a playwright who loves to drop plot twists. The elder brother Arthur died young, leaving the throne to Henry at the age of 17. Imagine it, just 17, and already bearing the weight of an entire kingdom, while at that age you might only be struggling with a math test and the pressure of a crush not replying to your message. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in the year 1509, all of Europe went wild over his appearance. The Venetian ambassador even praised him as more handsome than any Christian prince. Fair skin, reddish, gold hair, exceptional height, a toned body from fencing and daily horseback riding. If Instagram had existed then, surely the account at Prince Henry VIII would have gone viral, with followers perhaps surpassing even today's K-pop stars. This was the period when Henry truly embodied the image of a dream prince. But it was not only appearance. Henry was also intelligent, fond of sports, music, and the arts. He played the lute, composed songs, organized lavish festivals. Banquets stretched through the night, filled with wine and entertainment. For the people, the young king was a symbol of vitality and hope. A handsome king, athletic, with a taste for art sounding like the perfect combo even modern dating apps would struggle to produce. At the same time, Henry quickly revealed traits few dared to speak of openly. He was hot-tempered, sometimes making extreme decisions. Behind the glittering banquets lay the seeds of cruelty. History records that he did not hesitate to sign death warrants for anyone in his way, even high-ranking nobles. Historians still debate whether these harsh acts stemmed from strong political will or Henry's massive ego. What do you think? Perhaps just a mix of teenage hormones plus unlimited power turned out like that. One lesser-known fact. Henry was obsessed with fashion. His clothes were made from velvet, silk, embroidered with gold thread, sometimes even decorated with gemstones on his shoes. They said that when Henry entered a room, it seemed to light up not because of candles or bronze mirrors, but because of his glittering robes. Perhaps this was his way of declaring, "I am not just a king, I am the fashion icon of the century." If he lived today, surely Henry would launch his own luxury brand to rival the great fashion houses. Another interesting point. When newly crowned, Henry loved intense sports, such as horseback riding, fencing, even arm wrestling. The people called him the athlete king. But as you know, youth is active, yet as time passed, injuries and lavish indulgence transformed Henry into a very different figure. But in this moment, he was still radiant, full of vitality, like an Olympic athlete wearing a crown. Yet that brilliance also hid the first cracks. Henry began showing overconfidence, the sense that he was different and entitled. In history, this is considered the early sign of a turbulent reign. Scholars still differ. Was Henry truly a victim of circumstance, forced to become an Iron Man, or was it his inflated, arrogant nature that gradually dragged the dynasty into the abyss? To this day, the question has no satisfactory answer. You see, just Henry VIII's youth alone was already full of contradictions. On one side, the charming young man who played music, hosted glittering festivals. On the other, the budding seeds of violence, pride, and willingness to do anything to preserve power. That image is like a two-faced painting, dazzling from afar, but the closer you look, the more dark strokes you find beneath. And it was precisely this contrast that made him one of the most captivating yet frightening figures in English history. Now imagine yourself curled in a blanket, eyes half closed, listening to the story of a king whose love life was like a long-running series, both political and tragic. After the splendid coronation, Henry VIII quickly married Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother, to strengthen the alliance between England and Spain. For the people, this was a true royal wedding. Magnificent, solemn, and expected to open an era of stability. You know, when two great nations marry through royalty, the people hope for peace, while historians immediately open their notebooks, pondering which power will dominate whom. For more than 20 years of marriage, Catherine bore many children, but most died young. Only Princess Mary survived. And that was the problem. Henry needed a prince to succeed him. Imagine in that era, the pressure to have a son to secure the throne was even harsher than today's pressure to own the latest iPhone. Although Catherine was seen as gentle and loyal, her failure to produce a male heir made Henry dissatisfied, and he began glancing elsewhere, an interesting detail few notice. Henry initially loved Catherine deeply. They were once praised as Europe's golden couple. He often held banquets to honor his wife, and for many years their marriage was harmonious. But as the obsession with a son grew, love gave way to disappointment. Perhaps, if there had been marriage counseling programs back then, things would have been far less tense. By the year 1527, Henry sought to annul the marriage. He claimed it was against biblical law since Catherine had been his brother Arthur's wife. Henry quoted the Old Testament verse that the man who takes his brother's wife will be cursed with childlessness, a way to legitimize his desire for a son. But Pope Clement VII did not agree, especially as he was under political pressure from Spain, where Emperor Charles V was Catherine's nephew. See, royal family matters sometimes get as tangled as endless television dramas only here. Decisions could alter the fate of all Europe. When the Vatican refused, Henry played a grand move, completely separating England from the Roman Church. In 1534, he declared the Act of Supremacy, proclaiming himself head of the Church of England. This was a major historical milestone, the first time a European monarch openly severed ties with Rome, paving the way for the Protestant Reformation in England, also known as Anglicanism. This event was nothing less than a cultural shock. Over 1,500 years of European religious order broken because one king wanted to divorce and have a son. Of course, this decision was not only about love. It gave Henry unprecedented power. As supreme head of religion in the land, he was no longer interfered with by Rome. At the same time, he could confiscate the vast lands and wealth of Catholic monasteries, bringing immense finances to the crown. Think of a boss who holds both the parent company and subsidiaries, and also controls the bank vault. Such power is hard to imagine, yet the price was blood and tears. Many clergymen and nobles resisted, viewing Henry as a blasphemer. Most famous was Thomas More, the former chancellor, who firmly refused to recognize Henry as head of the church. He was executed, becoming a symbol of Catholic loyalty. These brutal acts revealed Henry's harsh nature. He was ready to sacrifice friends and close advisors to protect his personal will. Scholars remain divided. Was the split from Rome purely personal ambition, to divorce and marry Anne Boleyn to have a son, or also political wisdom, to seize absolute power and strengthen national sovereignty? Some see it as a strategic move, while others think it was only the result of a massive ego and stubbornness. Interestingly, even today, this debate remains unresolved. So you see, Henry VIII's first marriage was not merely a love story. It was the spark of a religious reformation that shook all Europe, while painting the portrait of a king both alluring and terrifying, willing to break traditions to satisfy personal desires. And as you breathe evenly, hearing this, perhaps you smile. It turns out that marital dramas are not only on today's social media, but once shook the throne half a millennium ago. Imagine this. A January morning in the year 1536, the festive air at Greenwich. Crowds gathered to watch King Henry VIII ride in a tournament. He was then 44 years old, but still eager to prove himself the sportsman heartthrob he once was. The horse's hooves thundered, armour gleamed under the winter sun. The crowd cheered, and then, in an instant, tragedy struck. The horse stumbled, lost balance, and collapsed, crushing the king's heavy body beneath it. Imagine, a mighty king suddenly lying motionless, like the protagonist in an action scene, but without a stunt double to rise in his place. Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours, sending the court into panic. Some whispered this might be a dire omen for the dynasty's downfall. When he awoke, the injury to his right leg was so severe it never fully healed. Muscles, bones, and blood vessels were damaged, leading to chronic ulcers. The wounds not only caused pain, but constantly oozed fluid, emitting a foul odour. So much so that when Henry entered a room, his stench preceded him by several chambers. Just imagine, if today there were a royal perfume named Henry VIII, surely no one would dare buy it. One little known detail. After the accident, Henry began wearing long trousers and heavier robes, not only to cover his increasingly obese frame but also to hide the bandages tightly wrapped around his leg. Servants recounted that during hot summer days, the palace reeked of ointment, rotting flesh, and burning candles trying to mask the truth. Of course, no one dared grimace. Showing disgust could mean instantly losing your job. In the literal sense, losing your head. This incident was not only a physical fall but also a psychological one. Many modern scholars believe Henry may have suffered mild brain trauma, leaving scars in the brain. This is a possible reason why his temperament grew more violent, irritable, and paranoid. Interestingly, right after the accident, Henry had his second wife, Anne Boleyn, arrested on charges of adultery and treason. Research in this area remains controversial. Was this a premeditated political act, or merely the result of a mind damaged by that fateful fall? After the incident, Henry changed drastically. The king, who had once been a skilled horseman and fencer, now had to accept limited mobility. He gradually appeared less in public, quickly gained weight from sitting too much and overeating. You know, there are accidents that seem to leave only scars on the skin. But for Henry, it opened the door to an entire chain of later tragedies, from failing health, altered personality, to the cold-blooded decisions that changed the history of England. And if you think that a fall from a horse is just a minor detail in a king's life, then remember, sometimes just one slip on a staircase can ruin an entire holiday. For Henry, that fall didn't just ruin a day, it ruined the rest of his life. Asterisk. You close your eyes, listening to the whirring of the fan, and imagine, a king once praised as the handsomest prince in Europe, now turned into a gigantic, beer-bellied uncle in the castle. After the fall of 1536, Henry VIII was almost incapable of vigorous movement. Instead of galloping on horseback or fencing valiantly, he sat more, ate more, and ballooned rapidly. His waistline expanded from 89 centimeters to more than 130. His weight exceeded 180 kilograms. It sounds as if he were a food influencer of the pre-modern era, but in fact he was the victim of a calorie-rich diet bordering on absurd. About 5,000 kilocalories a day, all red meat, meat pies, and heavy wine. If there had been a nutritionist at the time, Henry would surely have been banned from breakfast. A strange fact few people know. To move inside the palace, Henry had to use a pulley system and hoist frame, like a manual elevator built just for the king. Some doors in the castle even had to be widened to fit his body. Imagine working in court, and every time you heard the creak of the pulley being pulled, you knew immediately the king was approaching. along with the stench from the ulcers on his leg, detectable from 3 rooms away. Truly, not the kind of scent of power anyone would want to remember. Henry's spirit changed along with his body. He became quick to anger, insecure, and suspicious of others. The medical treatments of the time, cauterizing with hot iron, applying mercury ointment, or blood transfusions, not only failed but worsened his condition. The truth is still debated. Was it these misguided cures that hastened his collapse, or was his indulgent lifestyle the main cause? By 1540, Henry still tried to cling to a youthful image when he married Catherine Howard, a girl just 19 years old. Perhaps he hoped this marriage would rejuvenate him, but in reality it resembled a tragic play more than a love story. Catherine, unable to bear Henry's deformed body and volatile temper, committed adultery. When it was exposed, Henry ordered her execution, an act that further cemented his reputation for cruelty. The people were horrified, but also almost accustomed, for this was hardly the first time one of Henry's wives had faced the executioner's block. After that, Henry married for the 6th time to Catherine Parr. This was no longer a romantic union, but a necessary arrangement. Catherine became nurse and companion, tending to Henry in his final years. Her presence brought the court a degree of stability, but also revealed the stark truth. The king, who had once been a dazzling prince, now needed someone to support every step, bandage every wound, and manage every meal. Hearing this, you might smile slightly. It turns out Henry VIII was like many of us, fond of rich food, avoiding exercise, and then paying the price with his health. The only difference is that instead of a doctor reminding him to walk 30 minutes a day, he had an entire kingdom forced to endure the stench of his disease. And this, though it sounds a bit satirical, was the turning point that transformed Henry from the man of dreams into the living nightmare of the English court. Asterisk. You relax your shoulders, close your eyes, and imagine the English court in 1540 was not only filled with the sound of lutes or lavish banquets, but also echoed with the heavy breathing of a 49-year-old king, weighing over 180 kilograms, shuffling through the corridors like a ghost. Henry VIII, once Europe's heartthrob, had now become a sickly man, ulcerated legs, and volatile temper. And so, when everyone thought he was too feeble for marriage, Henry declared he would wed Catherine Howard, a girl only 19 years old. Imagine, if Instagram had existed, then the hashtag would be #wedding of the century. But in many hearts it seemed more like an impossible couple than a romance. Catherine Howard, cousin of Anne Boleyn, was described as young, radiant, and fond of parties. The age and physical disparity made this marriage a pre-written tragedy. She soon sought comfort in a young courtier, and then, when the affair was revealed, Henry erupted in rage. Catherine was executed in 1542, becoming the 4th victim among the king's 6 marriages. A little-known detail is that before her death, Catherine asked for a small block of wood to practice laying her head upon the scaffold so she would be more practiced. This detail sounds both tragic and chilling, and it still makes people shudder today. This story still has no final resolution. Was Catherine truly a traitor, or merely a young girl caught in the wheel of power, seeking a little warmth after being married off to a sickly, frightening king? Some argue the execution proves Henry's merciless nature, while others see it as the inevitable result of a court full of intrigue. In 1543, Henry remarried, this time to Catherine Parr. Unlike Catherine Howard, Parr was a learned noblewoman, gentle and very practical. This was no longer a marriage of love or lust, but one of politics and caregiving. Parr was tasked with keeping the court from turmoil and virtually became Henry's personal nurse. Imagine, instead of romantic dates, Parr was busy managing ointments, changing ulcer bandages, and advising the king to drink less wine. If there were a television show called Dating the Seriously Ill, Catherine Parr would surely be the protagonist. Yet it cannot be denied that Parr gave Henry something different: companionship. Though not burning passion, this relationship was a rare, soulmate bond. For the first time in years, Henry had a woman gentle enough to care for him and intelligent enough to debate. Parr also contributed to preserving the legacy of religious reform, resisting pressure to return to Catholicism. She even co-authored religious texts, a rare feat for a 16th century woman. Historians still debate Parr's role. Some see her as a savior who kept Henry's court from collapsing into chaos, others as merely a senior nurse disguised as queen. Whatever the case, no one denies she left an important mark on Henry's final years. Hearing this, you probably realize Henry VIII's marriages were like a multi-episode television series, full of drama, one episode ending with an execution, the next introducing a brand new character with a completely different personality. And if you think Netflix today is where the greatest plot twists exist, history shows the Tudor court had been writing those scripts since 1540. And so, in his twilight years, Henry was no longer the lecher seeking young brides, but an old, ailing man, needing someone to tend both his body and soothe his soul. Catherine Parr did that, making Henry's final marriage the rare chapter where gentleness overshadowed rage. Asterisk. You loosen your shoulders, close your eyes, listening to the fan's breeze, and imagine yourself drifting into Henry VIII's final years, when he was no longer the handsome, agile prince, but a heavy, suffering man, buried in bedding as his body rotted away day by day. After 1543, Henry's health plummeted without break. Gout caused painful joints, diabetes weakened his body, high blood pressure and heart failure made his breathing laboured. Some rumoured he had syphilis, but modern medicine claims the evidence is insufficient. These mysteries keep scholars divided. What was the primary illness leading to his collapse, or was it simply the cumulative result of years of indulgence and misguided medical care? A strange fact few know. There were days when Henry could not rise from bed. Attendants had to place him on a special wheeled chair to push him around the palace. It sounded like a wheelchair, but was far bulkier, more like a mobile throne. Except that instead of majesty, people saw a swollen-faced king, bandaged legs, sometimes nodding off right on the throne. If smartphones had existed then, surely social media would have overflowed with memes of the king dozing in the hallway. The ulcers on his legs grew worse. Necrotic flesh, exposed bone, pus, stench. So strong the entire palace used cloths soaked in oils to cover their noses. Courtiers entering his chamber were like stepping into an aromatherapy spa with a badly botched formula. In the winter of 1546, Henry endured high fevers that may have been caused by sepsis. Each night, his screams of pain echoed down the corridors, drowning out the court music. Psychologically, Henry became increasingly unstable. Obsessed with poisoning, he ordered all food to be tasted before serving. Knives, forks, cups, all had to be thoroughly checked, making the king's meals last as long as a full food safety inspection. Perhaps, if alive today, Henry would be the VIP customer of every food safety service. But in the 16th century, it only heightened court tension. To this day, scholars still disagree. Were these behaviours simply symptoms of illness and old age, or the consequence of brain damage from the horse accident of 1536? Some argue Henry suffered early dementia. Others believe it was the natural paranoia of someone who had wielded absolute power too long. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A court drowned in fear. No one dared say outright that the king was dying. The law of the time considered predicting the king's death an act of treason. Thus, even though the entire palace was filled with stench, even though Henry was only a shadow of himself, everyone still had to pretend to believe in recovery. You see, sometimes an entire kingdom had to live inside a fictional script just to keep themselves safe. And in that picture, Henry VIII appeared no longer as the dazzling protagonist, but only as a sick, lonely old man, clinging to the last shreds of power. Asterisk. You take a deep breath, imagining yourself standing in the great hall of Whitehall Palace in the year 1546. The air was so heavy that just stepping inside, you could feel the cold seeping from the thick stone walls. King Henry VIII, now only a shadow of the past, lay there with a massive body, hollowed eyes, but still clinging to his habit of controlling everything. And the most haunting obsession in the final year of his life was the fear of being poisoned. Henry believed that any dish could contain poison. Thus, he imposed a system of food safety that, if it existed today, would certainly make Michelin restaurants laugh. Before each meal, every dish had to be tasted by courtiers and cooks. Knives, forks, spoons, cups all had to be carefully inspected. He even issued a tasting law, which decreed that anyone who altered recipes or secretly sipped wine would be guilty of treason. You see, even if someone shook up a can of soda, in those days it was enough to cost them their life. A small secret in history. Henry even required the testing of tablecloths. Records say he once suspected that the smell of linen might be a sign of poison, so attendants had to spread the cloth, sniff every corner, before the dishes could be served. It sounded like a modern forensic investigation, except here, everything took place under the dim flicker of candles and constant fear. Some said this, others said that, no one agreed. Did this paranoia stem from brain trauma suffered in 1536, or was it simply the inevitable result of a king who had lived too long in the darkness of absolute power? Some believed that isolation made Henry see enemies everywhere. Others thought it was merely dementia, mixed with the physical torments of his body. It was not only food that Henry distrusted. He doubted even his most loyal men. A stray glance, an ambiguous phrase could become a pretext for execution. The court then resembled a tense stage play. Everyone performed perfect loyalty, and if they forgot their lines, it meant a permanent curtain fall. If compared to a modern office, working in the palace then was like joining a meeting where you dared not even cough, for fear the boss thought you were plotting a coup. Yet, amidst the frenzies of paranoia, Henry sometimes sank into strange silence. There were days he lay in bed for hours, saying nothing, his clouded eyes staring into nothingness. Then suddenly, he would burst into tears, calling the name Jane Seymour, the wife who had died giving birth to his son Edward, and Anne Boleyn, the wife he himself had executed. In those tears, people glimpsed another Henry, not a tyrant, but a lonely, regretful man trapped inside his memories and his decaying body. You see, the court then witnessed two men coexisting, one Henry VIII, cruel, ready to kill anyone, and one Henry VIII, fragile, yearning for a little love. This image was like two sides of a coin, shining when raised high, but tarnished, rusting when seen up close. And sometimes, it was these very contradictions that made you realize power can never obscure the truth that humans, whether kings or commoners, still carry fears, weaknesses, and belated regrets. Imagine. Whitehall Palace at the end of 1546 no longer resounded with party music, but was instead filled with the atmosphere of a field hospital. King Henry VIII, who had once made all of Europe tremble, now lay motionless on a massive bed, drenched in sweat, his breathing wheezing like wind through a winter crack. The high fevers came one after another, leaving him delirious, his skin flushed, then pale within hours. Picture it as a phone battery running low, blinking endlessly with battery-low warnings, but no one dared plug it in, because predicting the king's death could be considered treason. Yes, the law of the time forced the entire court into play acting, pretending to believe the king could still recover. An official event was recorded. On the night of the 27th of January, 1547, Henry VIII, nearly 55 years old, lay gasping. The royal physicians tried everything, bloodletting, infusions, heating ointments, all in vain. He groaned in pain, clutching his ulcers, his face twisted with fever. Occasionally, he had just enough strength to squeeze another's hand as a signal. In the final moment, when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer approached and asked if he still held faith, Henry could not speak, only grasped Cranmer's hand tightly as affirmation. That was the final gesture of a king who had once declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. A strange detail few know. In his dying days, Henry often whispered the names of two women, Jane Seymour, the wife who died giving birth to Edward, and Anne Boleyn, the wife he executed. Perhaps it was a sign of late remorse, or simply fragments of memory rising in delirium. Historians remain divided. Was this proof of true regret for his brutal choices, or only illusions brought on by fever and disease? The atmosphere in the palace was as tense as awaiting exam results, though everyone knew this test could not end with a high score. Courtiers covered their faces with scented cloths, doctors worried, Nobles stood silently in the halls, half hopeful, half fearful. You could compare it to a modern company scene. The great boss is dying, but no one dares discuss succession, only pretending all is well. And then, in the freezing winter night, as candles flickered faintly, the king who had broken the Pope's chains, who had made countless tremble at his wrath, departed in silence. No triumphal hymn, no fireworks, only the fading of weak breaths into nothing. Henry VIII, one of the most controversial figures in English history, ended his life, as we all do, a weary, fragile body, surrendering to the limits of nature. And you, lying there listening, may also exhale a long breath. For history always reminds us, no matter how great the power, it cannot outlast time and the sickness within one's own body. Asterisk. You listen, letting this tale lull you into an atmosphere both solemn and paradoxical. At dawn on the 28th of January 1547, Henry VIII finally exhaled his last in Whitehall Palace. No wailing, no trumpets of announcement, only a heavy silence blanketed the court. Picture it as when an office suddenly loses power. Everyone knows something big just happened, but no one dares say a word. For the law of the time deemed predicting or declaring the king's death treason. So even after he was gone, the courtiers still kept the mask of hope, as if the king were only in a long sleep. An official event was recorded. Henry's body was prepared in a special oak coffin, but his oversized frame forced carpenters to build an extra-large coffin, bigger than usual standards. This detail showed Henry's power still commanded even after death. He was too large, forcing funeral norms to change. A little-known fact. Henry's embalming was crude. His organs were removed. Then his chest and abdomen were stuffed with fragrant herbs. Cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper. It sounded like a recipe for an expensive dish, except the main ingredient was the king's body. But the limited technique left the corpse still leaking, the stench still rising. If you have ever bought an essential oil diffuser, but chose a scent too pungent, you understand the courtier's plight, trying to mask the truth, but only making it worse. This field of study is still debated. Why was the funeral delayed until the 16th of February, nearly 3 weeks after Henry's death? Some argue it was to prepare grand ceremonies for a powerful king. Others point out his body was too hard to preserve, so the delay only worsened matters. Either way, the result was that thousands of guests endured the stench from the coffin, even amid solemn dirges and mourning banners. Imagine it, St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the day of burial, a scene both grand and suffocating. Cavalry escort, black flags flying, trumpets resounding, but mingled with faces struggling to remain composed while enduring the stench of death straight up their noses. If air purifiers had existed, they would have been the most precious gift the court could ever receive. And so, the king who had shaken Europe with the decision to sever England from Rome, who had made countless lives fall with a single nod, was finally laid in the ground with a paradox. The grander the funeral, the more the stench exposed the fragility of man. Hearing this, you may smile sadly, so even a royal funeral could not escape the truth. Lanterns and flowers outside, but inside, unbearable. And that was the strange combination of power, ritual, and harsh truth, an ending both glorious and humiliating for the life of Henry VIII. Asterisk. You breathe evenly, close your eyes, and imagine the scene of a silent night in the chapel of Can Abbey, where the coffin of Henry VIII was temporarily placed awaiting burial. A candle cast dim golden light upon the cold stone walls, the air so quiet you could hear drops of wax falling onto the tiled floor. Yet that silence could not mask the stench spreading from the oversized coffin. Gas and fluids from the decomposing body seeped through the cracks of the wood, dripping onto the floor. And then, a sight no one in the court wished to remember. A few stray dogs slipped into the chapel, curiously licking at the murky liquid. This was an official historical event recorded, and indeed one of the most humiliating moments for English royalty. A king who once considered himself the image of God on earth, in the end, had his corpse desecrated by wandering animals. If you compare it to modern times, the feeling is like a CEO of a major company having their personal emails leaked in the middle of a global meeting. Embarrassing, irreversible, and witnessed by all. A small secret in history. The officials in charge of the funeral tried to cover it up. They hurriedly burned more incense, scattered dried flowers around the area, and even sealed the coffin temporarily with beeswax to stop the seepage. But nothing could mask the smell of death mixed with herbs, creating one of the most unbearable perfumes in royal history. It was said some nobles had to press rose oil-soaked cloths tightly to their noses, only to drop them minutes later, unable to endure. The truth remains debated. Did the story of dogs licking fluids from the coffin truly happen, or was it a fabrication by enemies of the Tudor dynasty? Some argue it was real, recorded by several contemporary sources. Others doubt, claiming it was a way to tarnish Henry's image after his death, turning his demise into a symbolic warning. But whether fact or fiction, the tale endures as proof of the collapse of the myth of power. Even kings cannot escape the destruction of nature and the cruelty of time. Picture it. While knights prepared a grand funeral with black flags, battle drums, and mournful trumpets, in a hidden corner of the chapel, a few stray dogs quietly gnawed at the truth that Henry VIII was no longer supreme king, but merely a decaying body. That contrast shook the court. Majesty outside, disgrace inside, and perhaps that too was a great lesson of history. You can build a glorious image, you can paint the portrait of eternal power, but in the end, what remains is still the raw truth of the human body. It sounds ironic, but it is like spending a whole day editing a photo for social media while your friends in real life still see you yawning at the cafe. Power or fame, in the end, must face reality, and in the case of Henry VIII, that reality arrived with an unforgettable stench, spreading down the palace corridors, leaving history not only with a death, but with a shameful memory we still whisper about today. Asterisk. You relax your shoulders, letting gentle sounds carry you back to the 16th century, when one decision by Henry VIII shook all of Europe. Though his death was tragic, his political legacy left an indelible mark. The separation from the papacy and the birth of the Church of England. This was not only an official historic event, but also a turning point that forever changed the religious and political landscape. You might imagine it as a major company declaring independence from its parent corporation and building its own brand. At first, everyone was shocked, but gradually it became a new force not to be underestimated. An interesting fact few know. When Henry decided to confiscate the property of monasteries, a massive fortune poured into the royal treasury. Many lands once owned by the church became royal possessions, and some of the splendid castles you see today in England were built from this very wealth. So, if one day you visit Hampton Court Palace and marvel at its grandeur, remember that part of the construction budget came from the sale of monastic property. Scholars remain divided. Was Henry truly a visionary, religious reformer, or merely a selfish king wanting to discard his wife and seize church wealth? Some argue he truly paved the way for the growth of Protestantism, giving England its own religious identity, preparing the foundation for Elizabeth I to lead the nation into its golden age. Others bluntly say Henry cared little for theology, focusing only on his bedchamber and his coffers. Think of it. A man obsessed with lacking a male heir, his political and religious motivations likely revolved around that personal goal. Yet what cannot be denied is that Henry VIII achieved what few dared, breaking the ancient power of the Vatican. Before him, kings across Europe still had to look to Rome for permission on many matters. But Henry declared, "No, from now on, England will have its own path." It sounded more like a start-up's declaration of independence than a religious decision. But that gamble made him an irreplaceable historical figure. Imagine the English people then, like unwilling spectators. One morning they awoke to find the church renamed, rituals changed, and the whole country stepping into a new era. Some supported, some opposed, while many priests labelled disobedient paid with their lives. Society was tense and uneasy, but it also sparked lively religious debates that echo even today. In modern terms, you could view Henry as a CEO who dared to tear down an old system to build a new brand, despite losing customers, facing press attacks, and rivals circling. Of course, this business strategy was blood-stained, accompanied by the executions of many dissenters. But in hindsight, we must admit, England became a nation with its own religious identity, no longer a branch of Rome, and so, amid ulcers, pain, and loneliness at the end of his life, Henry VIII still left an indelible mark, turning England into a country separate from Vatican influence, paving the way for the brilliant Elizabethan era. Listening to this, you may smile. Indeed, a decision born out of family matters could reshape the history of Europe. Sometimes, what seems very personal creates a legacy of centuries. Asterisk. You take a deep breath, letting imagination carry you back to 16th century England, when a small girl, once dismissed as a bastard child, rose to become one of the greatest queens in history. That was Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her mother was beheaded when Elizabeth was only 3 years old, her father infamous for cruelty, and her entire childhood marked by insecurity. One day treated as a princess, the next cast aside as common. You might think, growing up in such a drama-filled family, how could one keep psychological balance? But it was precisely this adversity that forged Elizabeth into a sharp, cautious, and resilient ruler. In the year 1558, Elizabeth I officially ascended the throne, beginning a reign of 45 years, often called the Golden Age of England. This was a period when culture, arts, science, and seafaring all flourished. William Shakespeare shone with immortal plays, Francis Drake sailed around the world, and England began building its status as an overseas power. In modern comparison, you could imagine Elizabeth as a young CEO inheriting a company buried in debt and scandal, yet transforming it into a top-tier multinational corporation. A little-known historical secret. Elizabeth once declared she would remain single and never marry, calling herself the Virgin Queen. This decision was not only personal but profoundly political. By refusing marriage, she avoided the risk of foreign exploitation through dynastic alliances and kept full sovereignty in her hands. Today, you could see it as the classic version of the voluntary single movement, but with the stature of ruling an entire nation. Historians still debate. Was Elizabeth truly determined never to love? Or did she cleverly use the image of a lonely woman as a political tool to hold power? Some believe she truly sacrificed personal life for the nation. Others think Elizabeth had secret romances, but chose concealment for the sake of the crown. Whatever the truth, that cleverness allowed her to keep the throne more securely than any queen before her. Elizabeth also inherited the religious legacy of Henry VIII. She consolidated Anglicanism, but with more flexibility, firm enough to protect England's religious identity, yet deft enough to avoid bloody religious wars like in France. Her diplomacy was like a balancing act, walking the tightrope between mighty Spain and ambitious France. When needed, she was hard as steel. When needed, soft as silk. Imagine today, if Elizabeth played judge in a reality competition, she would surely win the award for Best Emotional Balancing Performance. The fascinating contrast was that, while her father Henry VIII is remembered for 6 wives and a humiliating death, Elizabeth I is celebrated as England's Sunday Queen. This created a strange duality. From a dynasty of blood and chaos emerged an era of stability and brilliance. And so, as you lie still listening to this, you realize the legacy of Henry VIII, though much of it bore the marks of cruelty and selfishness, created the ground for Elizabeth I to rise. He left behind a church separated from Rome, a monarchy with concentrated power, and from that Elizabeth inherited the political framework to build a golden age. You may smile softly. It turns out, even a notoriously ruthless father could unwittingly hand his daughter the foundation to become a great symbol of female power, and that is what history wants to remind you. From within darkness, sometimes the brightest light is born. Asterisk, you take a slow breath, letting this narration lead you into the final reflections on the life of Henry VIII. From a radiant prince with red gold hair and an athletic body admired across Europe, he ended as a decaying corpse, his stench haunting the palace. That transformation was like a film on fast forward. from the glittering trailer at the beginning to the messy backstage scene at the end. Do you hear the contrast? It is both terrifying and full of warning. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547, and that death not only closed a life but also ended the illusion that power could defy nature. A man who once called himself supreme head of the Church of England, who executed wives, ministers, and redrew the map of European religion, in the end still surrendered to disease. A little-known detail: the imposing portraits of Henry hanging in the palace continued to be displayed even after his death, with a sturdy stance and stern gaze. Meanwhile, his real body was rotting day by day in the coffin. This contrast, you see, was no different than on social media where we edit glamorous photos, while in reality we lie around in worn-out pajamas. History, it seems, also knows how to use filters, no less than Instagram. The mysteries surrounding this leave scholars divided. Did Henry realize his own fragility in his final days? Some believe he regretted, as shown when he called the names Jane Seymour and Anne Boleyn in delirium. Others argue Henry died still clinging to the belief he was untouchable, and those tears were nothing more than the reactions of a body collapsing. Whatever the truth, his image remains a paradox, both absolute in power and utterly weak. And that is the lesson of humanity. No matter how many fortresses of power you build, in the end, birth, aging, sickness, death remains the common law. A king may execute half a dozen wives, challenge the Pope, and sign decrees that reshape a continent's faith, but he cannot escape festering ulcers and shallow breaths. It sounds ironic, but it reminds us that power is fleeting, while the human body is the true limit. As you lie listening to this story, you may also feel a strange comfort, because history is not only numbers and battles, but also a mirror reflecting our lives. Looking at Henry VIII, from perfect prince to obese king, from throne to leaking coffin, you realize that all the trappings of glory will fade. Only one question remains: how have we lived, and what legacy will we leave? And for Henry, that legacy was both splendid and cautionary. Splendid, because he changed England's political and religious structure, but cautionary, because his humiliating death remains living proof that, in the end, all must face the fragility of human life. Asterisk. You relax gently, imagining the wind slipping through the window of an old palace, whispering a simple but bitter lesson. Power may shake Europe, but it cannot conquer the aching of joints or a festering wound. Henry VIII was living proof. He could call himself supreme head of the Church of England, order executions of opponents, or sign decrees to alter the continent's religious order. But in the end, he lay immobile, gasping, unable to escape the law of birth, aging, sickness, death. Official history shows Henry VIII built a powerful centralized monarchy, rising above the Pope, establishing a model of power that people called the king on the summit. Yet his death stripped the paradox bare. When that power faced disease and death, all thrones, swords, and robes became nothing but meaningless cloth, a small secret in history. In his last years, Henry ordered courtiers to carry him to council meetings on a giant chair, hidden by curtains so no one could see his swollen body. That curtain was like a filter of the Middle Ages, maintaining the outward image of majesty while inside he trembled in pain. But the stench of ulcers and heavy breathing could not be hidden forever. It was like posting radiant photos online while friends in real life still see you with dark circles and your third cup of coffee that day. Historians still argue, did Henry truly believe he was immortal in power, or deep down did he know it was only self-delusion? Some say he clung to the sacredness of kingship until the end. Others believe his moments of calling old wives' names in delirium were signs he understood his helplessness before nature. The question remains open, like a pause in history's melody. What is certain is that the confrontation between royal power and natural law ended with nature's victory. You might imagine Henry like a great company boss, thinking he could buy everything, from staff to markets, yet helpless before the deadline of creation. And this time, there was no extension. You listen in silence, perhaps with a bitter smile. It turns out what is called absolute power only exists in documents and rituals. The human body still exposes the truth. All weaken, fall ill, and ultimately disappear. Henry VIII, with all his throne and crown, was no different from you and me, passengers on a one-way train called time. And so, Henry's reign left not only castles and decrees, but also a gentle yet clear lesson. Power may instill fear, but nature is the one that makes all equal. Asterisk. You slow your breath, hearing the story drift to its final note, where history is no longer glorious battles or splendid edicts, but a gentle lesson in humanity, though tinged with bitterness. The legacy of Henry VIII, seen from politics, is immense. He laid the foundation for the Church of England, a religious institution that still exists today, a living testament to his decision to create his own brand. In family terms, Elizabeth I, the daughter whose mother was executed and father branded a tyrant, stood to steer England into a golden age, leaving echoes still resounding into the 21st century, a small secret in history. For centuries after Henry's death, his portraits continued to hang in palaces, as if to affirm that this was once the most powerful man in England. But here lies an interesting paradox. It was his daughter Elizabeth who was remembered by the people with longer admiration. You see, sometimes history is like a music chart. The song once expected to be a hit quickly fades, while a B-side track unexpectedly becomes legendary. Experts still quarrel loudly over this. Should Henry VIII be remembered as a great reformer, or only as a greedy, selfish man who destroyed tradition for personal gain? One side argues that without Henry, England could not have developed into an independent nation in religion and politics, nor entered Elizabeth's golden age. But the other side criticizes, saying everything Henry did stemmed from personal obsessions, with a male heir, with sex, with absolute power. That debate remains unresolved, like an endless online thread. What is certain is that his death carried an unforgettable image, not a triumphant song, but the stench of decay, the fearful whispers of courtiers, and the sight of stray dogs licking seepage from his coffin. That humiliating symbol speaks not only of the collapse of a body, but also as a reminder that even the mightiest dynasties can shrink to utter smallness. And as you lie listening to this story, you may let out a light laugh. So, all the wealth, crowns, and thrones finally condense into a few images for later generations to gossip over with surprise, with fear, and with pity. Henry VIII, the king who once challenged the Pope, was in the end defeated by his own body and by time, the opponent no one escapes. The lesson left to posterity is simple yet profound. Power, money, and riches may place you high above, but they cannot save you from the law of birth. Aging, sickness, death. What remains, after all, is not the fragrance of perfume or the sound of funeral drums, but the way you leave a legacy for the generations to come. Henry left behind a church, a political order, and a human lesson. And you, what will you leave?